This entire property is a blight on the community, Major Thorne, and we are officially petitioning the county to have it condemned. The words hung in the humid afternoon air, thick and foul like swamp gas. Karen Miller, the president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association, stood on the edge of my property line as if crossing it would soil her pristine white sneakers. She wasn't just plus size. She was a monument to gravitational certainty, a woman whose physical presence was matched only by the sheer, unyielding density of her entitlement. She held a clipboard like a scepter, a cheap piece of pressboard elevated to an instrument of judgment. Behind her, her two acolytes, Barb and Sheila, nodded in sycophantic rhythm, their faces pinched with the sour satisfaction of those who live to enforce rules they themselves could never be bothered to follow. My land, the 100 acres my great-grandfather had carved out of the wilderness with his own 2 hands, the soil that held 4 generations of my family's sweat and blood, was a blight. The farmhouse, a sturdy 2-story structure of heart pine and fieldstone that had withstood a century and a half of hurricanes and history, was now, according to the suburban empress, fit only for the wrecking ball. The condemnation notice she waved in her pudgy hand wasn't even a real legal document. It was a letter of intent, a declaration of war printed on the HOA's ostentatious letterhead. She wanted my land for a community wellness center, a euphemism for a second swimming pool and a yoga studio, so the residents of Whispering Pines could have a closer place to complain about their gluten sensitivity. I just looked at her, my gaze flat. 25 years in the Army, with deployments in places that would make her manicured cul-de-sacs seem like a fever dream, had taught me to control my response. Anger is a fire. You can let it consume you, or you can forge it into a weapon. My fire was being stoked into a blast furnace. "You're standing on private property, Karen," I said, my voice low and even. "And you are not a county official. You have no authority here." She gave a dismissive, airy laugh. "Oh, we have authority. The covenants are very clear about aesthetic harmony. Your rustic antiquity is dragging down property values. We have a civic duty to act." I felt a slow, dangerous calm settle over me. It was the same feeling I'd get right before a mission went sideways, the moment when the chaos crystallized into a single, clear objective. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She saw a retired soldier puttering around an old farm. She didn't see the man who had spent the last 5 years of his civilian life building an investment portfolio, the man who had quietly become the majority partner in the very regional bank that held the master loan on her entire precious, over-leveraged subdivision. She thought she was threatening my home. She had just handed me the keys to hers. This was the moment she sealed her own fate. She just didn't know it yet. If you've ever had to deal with a power-tripping HOA board or a neighborhood tyrant like Karen, you know exactly the kind of slow-burning rage I'm talking about. Do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because you're going to want to see how this plays out. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, or better yet, share your own HOA nightmare story. I want to hear them. Now, let me tell you how we got here, and more importantly, how I decided to dismantle Karen Miller's little empire, piece by bureaucratic piece. The fight for my home didn't start with a condemnation notice. It began with the rustle of leaves and the quiet turning of pages in a dusty old ledger, long before Karen even knew my name. My connection to this land wasn't just a deed in a county clerk's office. It was written in the rings of the ancient oaks that shaded the farmhouse. My great-grandfather, Elias Thorne, received the original land grant in 1878. He built the house, the barn, and planted the first row of pecan trees that now formed a majestic, gnarled canopy along the driveway. My grandfather, Samuel, was born in the downstairs bedroom, the same room where he passed away peacefully 92 years later, leaving the farm to me. I was his only grandchild, the last of the Thorne line. I spent my summers here as a boy, learning to fix fences, drive a tractor, and tell the difference between a copperhead and a king snake. The scent of hay in the barn and the taste of my grandmother's peach cobbler were woven into my DNA. But I heard a different calling. I joined the Army right out of high school, wanting to serve, to see the world beyond the county line. My career was my life. I rose through the ranks, became an officer, a major in the infantry. I led men in places whose names were just harsh consonants on the news back home. I learned logistics, strategy, and the unshakable importance of a well-executed plan. I learned how to read people, how to identify their motivations and their weaknesses. And through it all, the farm was my anchor, the place my mind went during long, sleepless nights in a dusty cot thousands of miles from home. When my grandfather passed, I was on my final tour. I came home on leave to bury him, and walking the property, I felt a profound sense of responsibility settle on my shoulders. It was time to come home for good. I took my retirement, trading my combat boots for work boots. The first year was one of healing and rediscovery. I repaired the roof on the barn, cleared the overgrown pastures, and spent hours on the porch swing, just listening to the cicadas, letting the quiet seep into the cracks the army had left in my soul. Then they started building. The developer who bought the adjacent 1,000 acres was aggressive. Within 2 years, the fields where I used to watch deer graze were scraped bare and replaced with a sprawling labyrinth of identical beige houses. Whispering Pines Estates. The name itself was an insult to the towering longleaf pines they'd bulldozed to make way for it. From the beginning, my farm was an anomaly, an island of authentic history in their sea of manufactured prestige. I was grandfathered in, my property lines clearly demarcated and legally separate from their new development. I wasn't a member of their HOA, wasn't subject to their rules. And that drove them insane. The first skirmishes were minor. A polite letter about the visual impact of my compost pile. A passive-aggressive note left on my mailbox about the crowing of my rooster at dawn. I ignored them. Then Karen Miller was elected HOA president. Her campaign platform had apparently been centered on addressing the thorn problem. The polite letters became official-looking notices of violation, citing HOA bylaws that didn't apply to me. I sent one, and only one, certified letter back to the HOA board, drafted by a lawyer friend, politely explaining the legal status of my property and advising them to cease all communication. For a while, it worked. The letters stopped, but I could feel her watching. I'd see her car, a boat-sized white SUV, driving slowly past my property line. I'd catch her staring from her own back deck, which overlooked my lower pasture. It was the look of a predator sizing up its prey. She was waiting, planning. I had underestimated her ambition. I knew she was a problem, but I didn't realize she was a zealot. She didn't just want me to mow my lawn to her standards. She wanted my land. She saw 100 acres of imperfection, a historical scar on her flawless vision of suburban order. And in her small, power-starved world, anything that didn't conform had to be eradicated. That humid afternoon, when she stood there with her clipboard and her condemnation threat, I finally understood. This wasn't about property values. This was about conquest. The moment Karen and her entourage retreated in their golf cart, a cloud of smugness trailing behind them like exhaust fumes, I walked back inside the farmhouse. The air inside was cool and smelled of old wood and lemon oil, a scent of stability that stood in stark contrast to the violation I felt. I stood in the living room, my hand resting on the massive stone fireplace my great-grandfather had built, each rock hauled from the creek bed a quarter-mile away. This house wasn't just a structure. It was a testament. It was proof that something built with integrity and purpose could endure. Karen's threat was an obscenity, a declaration that history and heritage were worthless in the face of her beige-painted tyranny. My first call was not to a lawyer. It was to my financial advisor, a sharp woman named Chloe who managed the day-to-day operations of the investment firm I'd partnered in after retiring. "Chloe," I said, my voice tight, "I need a full workup on a local entity.
Whispern Pine Istahoa.
And I need everything you can find on their lender, a small outfit called Piedmont Community Bank." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Marcus, are you okay? You sound focused." "I'm focused," I confirmed. "Consider this a priority 1 intelligence gathering operation." I could almost hear her smile. "Consider it done. You want the full playbook? Assets, liabilities, leadership profiles, loan covenants, the works." "The works," I said. "I want to know where every dollar comes from and where every dollar goes. And I want to know who holds the paper." My second call was to David Chun, a man I'd served with in the JAG Corps before he left to start his own private practice. He was a bulldog of a lawyer, meticulous and utterly relentless. "Dave, it's Marcus Thorne, Major," he answered, his voice as crisp as a starched uniform. "Don't tell me you've finally decided to sue the VA for poisoning you with their cafeteria food." "Worse," I said. "H.O." I heard him sigh, a long, weary sound. "Say no more. The suburban mafia. What did they do?" I explained the confrontation, the condemnation threat, the absurd charge of blight. I emailed him a photo of the letter Karen had handed me. He was silent for a long moment. "Okay," he said finally, the weariness replaced by a familiar steel. "This is ambitious, even for an HOA. They can't just condemn your property. That's a governmental power, eminent domain. They can petition, they can make a nuisance of themselves, but they can't force a condemnation. However, if they have a friend on the county commission, they can make your life hell. This is harassment, pure and simple, with a side of attempted land theft," he continued. "First things first, we document everything. Every interaction, every letter, every stray golf ball that lands on your lawn. Get a high-quality security camera system, something with clear audio. I want footage of your property lines, your driveway, every angle. From this moment on, you are building a case. Assume everything Karen does is a calculated move in a long campaign. We need to be more disciplined, more prepared, and more ruthless than she is." The word ruthless hung in the air. It wasn't a word I used lightly. But looking out my window at the ancient oak tree my grandfather had taught me to climb, I knew David was right. This wasn't a disagreement between neighbors. This was war. And in war, you don't fight fair. You fight to win. Over the next week, my farm transformed into a fortress of documentation. I installed a series of high-definition night vision cameras that covered every inch of my property's perimeter. I bought a digital voice recorder that I carried with me whenever I was outside. I started a logbook, detailing every slow drive-by from Karen's white SUV, every sneer from a passing resident on a golf cart. And the official notices started arriving. They came via certified mail, thick envelopes filled with sanctimonious prose and threats of fines. A violation for unapproved agricultural equipment, with a blurry photo of my grandfather's lovingly restored 1953 John Deere tractor, which I kept parked near the barn as a piece of history. A fine for non-conforming fencing, referring to the 100-year-old split-rail fence that marked my northern pasture. A warning about excessive noise pollution, because my rooster, General Patton, had the audacity to crow at sunrise. Each notice was a piece of paper, a bureaucratic jab designed to wear me down, to bury me in paperwork until I gave up. But they didn't know I was a man who had spent a decade mastering the military's Byzantine bureaucracy. Paperwork wasn't my enemy. It was my ammunition. I didn't respond to them. Instead, I filed each one meticulously in a binder, cross-referenced with photos, dates, and times. Each absurd accusation was another brick in the wall of evidence I was building against Karen Miller. She thought she was laying a siege. In reality, she was handing me the blueprints to her own destruction. The reports from Chloe started to trickle in, and they were more illuminating than I could have hoped. The Whispering Pines HOA was a financial house of cards. Their budget was bloated, with a huge portion allocated to community beautification and legal consulting. The beautification funds were paying for extravagant seasonal flower arrangements from a nursery owned by Karen's sister. The legal consulting fees, which had skyrocketed since she took office, were going to a firm where her brother-in-law was a partner. It was textbook nepotism and self-dealing, all hidden in plain sight within line items of their annual budget, a document most residents probably never bothered to read. But the real prize was the information on Piedmont Community Bank. Just as I suspected, the bank held the master loan for the entire development. A massive multi-million-dollar note that covered the cost of the infrastructure, the clubhouse, the pools, and all the common areas. The HOA's annual dues were primarily used to service the interest on this loan. My investment firm had acquired a controlling interest in the bank's parent company, a regional financial group, 18 months ago. It had been a strategic move to diversify our portfolio into community banking. I was, for all intents and purposes, Karen Miller's landlord on a grand scale. She was threatening to take my home while living in a house of debt owned by me. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. David's legal strategy was taking shape alongside my financial one. They're trying to build a public nuisance case, he explained over the phone, his voice sharp with focus. They'll argue to the county that your farm is unsafe, unsanitary, or otherwise detrimental to the public good. It's a long shot, but if they can get a sympathetic ear on the zoning board, they can tie you up in hearings and inspections for years. Karen was already moving on that front. I received a formal notice from the county planning and zoning department. A site inspection had been scheduled to assess my property for compliance with county code regarding blighted properties. The request, the notice stated, had been filed by a concerned citizens group, the Committee for Community Harmony. I didn't need a detective to figure out who was on that committee. The inspection was scheduled for 2 weeks out. It was a clear escalation, moving from the toothless realm of the HOA into the legitimate power of the county government. This was her first major offensive, and I had to meet it with overwhelming force. Let them come, I told David. We'll be ready. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing for that inspection with the same precision I would have used for a battalion review. I didn't change the character of the farm, that was the whole point. But I made sure everything was in its perfect, rustic place. The antique tractor was polished to a gleam. The split rail fences were checked for any loose rails. The barn was swept clean, tools hung neatly on the walls. I even gave General Patton a bath. I was turning their weapon back on them. They wanted to inspect my property for blight. I would give them a showcase of historical preservation. But my real work was happening at night, at my grandfather's old oak desk. I was cross-referencing Chloe's financial reports with the public records of the HOA. I found a pattern. Every time Karen levied a big fine against a resident, there was a corresponding, vaguely described expenditure from the HOA's operating budget a few weeks later. She wasn't just a bully. She was using the fines as her own personal slush fund, funneling money through her family's businesses under the guise of community expenses. She was a thief hiding behind a clipboard and a rulebook. The day of the inspection arrived, a bright, clear morning. At precisely 10 a.m., a county vehicle pulled up my driveway, followed closely by Karen's white SUV. She wasn't an official party to the inspection, but she was there to watch, to gloat. A man in a county polo shirt, a Mr. Henderson, stepped out, looking uncomfortable. Karen, Barb, and Sheila stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed, exuding an aura of smug expectation. They were here for the kill. They expected to find decay, neglect, a reason to justify their crusade. What they found was me, standing on my porch in a clean work shirt and jeans, holding a steaming mug of coffee. And next to me stood David, in a perfectly tailored suit, holding a leather briefcase. Karen's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. This wasn't in her script. Mr. Henderson, I said, walking down the steps to greet the inspector. Marcus Thorne, welcome to my home. This is my legal counsel. David Chun Henderson shook our hands, his eyes darting nervously towards Karen. Just a routine inspection, Mr. Thorne. Won't take long. Take all the time you need, I said with a smile. I'm proud of this place. I've got nothing to hide. The inspection was a farce, and Karen knew it the moment David started speaking. As Mr. Henderson began his walk around, clipboard in hand, David shadowed him, providing a calm, running commentary. When Henderson looked at the antique tractor, David was there. As you can see, this is a piece of local agricultural history, lovingly maintained. It's a non-operational display piece, fully compliant with all county codes regarding private property displays. When Henderson glanced at the chicken coop, David chimed in. This structure predates the county's current zoning regulations by approximately 70 years, and is therefore fully grandfathered in. However, my client has proactively upgraded it to exceed all modern standards for animal welfare. As you can see from the ventilation and square footage per animal with every step, David preempted any potential criticism, citing county ordinances, legal precedents, and property law with the effortless authority of a man who had memorized the entire legal code. He turned their inspection into a guided tour of my unimpeachable position. I watched Karen's face transform from smug anticipation to pinched frustration, then to outright fury. This was not the crumbling, derelict fire trap she had described in her complaint. This was a property that was not just maintained, but curated. It was a living museum, and I was its caretaker. The final stop was the old stone wall that separated my lower pasture from the pristine backyards of the Whispering Pines homes. Henderson ran his hand over the stones, mossy with age. "This wall," he began, looking for something, anything to write down. "Built in 1885 from local fieldstone," David said smoothly. "It's listed on the county's historical register. Any attempt to alter or remove it would be a Class B misdemeanor. My client inspects it for stability twice a year. It's not going anywhere." Henderson finally gave up. He scribbled a few notes, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Thorne. The property is old, but it's clearly well maintained. I'll be filing my report this afternoon. You'll receive a copy." He couldn't get back to his truck fast enough. As he drove away, Karen marched up to my property line, her face a mask of incandescent rage. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You think your slick lawyer can stop this? I am on the board of this community. I will not have this junkyard ruining our view." It was time to start building my own army. That evening, I walked through the Whispering Pines subdivision for the first time. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for allies. I had a list, compiled from my research into the HOA's fine history. My first stop was the home of Arthur and Marion Peterson, an elderly couple in their late 70s. Their house was immaculate, their garden a riot of color. They had been fined $200 the previous month for having a bird feeder that was not of an approved design. I knocked on their door. Arthur answered, a kind-faced man with a slight tremor in his hands. He looked at me with suspicion. He knew who I was, the farmer, the enemy. "Mr. Peterson," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "My name is Marcus Thorne. I'm your neighbor on the other side of the stone wall. I'm not here to cause trouble. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about your experience with the HOA." He hesitated, then saw the sincerity in my eyes. He invited me in. Marion joined us in the living room, a plate of cookies appearing on the coffee table as if by magic. For an hour, they told me their story. They had lived here for 10 years, but since Karen took over, their lives had been a constant stream of petty harassments. Fines for their grandchildren leaving toys on the lawn. Warnings about their holiday decorations being up 2 days past the approved date. The bird feeder was the final straw. "We've been feeding the cardinals for 40 years, Marion said, her voice trembling slightly. She called it attracting vermin. It broke my heart to take it down. I listened, I nodded, and I took notes. Before I left, I said, "I think Karen Miller has overstepped her authority. I'm looking into what can be done. I'd appreciate it if you'd think about whether you'd be willing to share your story if it came to it." Arthur walked me to the door. "Son," he said, his eyes hard, "you just tell us when and where." My next visit was to the Rodriguez family, a young couple with 2 small children. They had been threatened with a lien on their property over the color of their children's playset, which was a cheerful primary red and blue, not one of the 50 approved shades of beige. They were scared. They were a young family, and the threat of a lien was terrifying. I explained to them, in simple terms, the legal limits of an HOA's power. I told them about the financial irregularities I had discovered. I showed them they weren't alone. By the end of the night, I had spoken to 5 families. The story was the same everywhere. A pattern of bullying, selective enforcement, and financial intimidation, all orchestrated by one woman. Karen hadn't just declared war on me. She had declared war on anyone who didn't fit her perfect, sterile mold. She thought she was isolating me, painting me as the other. But in her arrogance, she had created a silent, scattered resistance. All I had to do was unite them. The failed inspection lit a fire under Karen. The harassment escalated from bureaucratic to personal. The Whispering Pines weekly e-newsletter, which she personally wrote, began to feature thinly veiled articles about the importance of maintaining community standards and the dangers of rural blight encroaching on suburban life. She was trying to poison the well, to paint me as a threat to her residents' way of life and their property values. It was a classic tactic: create a common enemy to consolidate power. The problem for her was that her campaign of petty tyranny had already created a different common enemy: herself. My nightly walks became a regular occurrence. I'd share information with the Petersons, who would then talk to their friends on the bridge club. I'd update the Rodriguez family, who would spread the word to other young families at the community playground. A quiet network of dissent was forming, a neighborhood watch aimed not at outside threats, but at its own leadership. We communicated through hushed conversations over garden fences and discreet emails. It felt like organizing an insurgency, and in a way it was. We were taking back our community from a dictator. The key was the information I was gathering. With Chloe's help, I had a complete financial picture of the HOA, and it was damning. I shared it with David, and his reaction was a low whistle. "This is more than just bad governance, Marcus," he said, looking over the spreadsheets I had printed out and spread across my dining room table. "This is wire fraud, embezzlement, racketeering. She's using the HOA as a private piggy bank and a tool for intimidation. If we take this to the district attorney, she could be facing jail time." I considered it. The thought of seeing Karen in handcuffs was satisfying, but a criminal case would be slow and messy. More importantly, it wouldn't solve the immediate problem: the threat to my home and the financial health of the community. A DA investigation wouldn't stop her from using HOA funds to continue her legal assault on me, and it wouldn't fix the underlying rot in the HOA's finances. "No," I said, shaking my head. "Not yet. A criminal case is a sledgehammer. I need a scalpel. There's a better way to do this. A way that exposes her, removes her from power, and gives the community the chance to fix itself." It was then that I decided to reveal my ace in the hole to David. I pulled out another folder, this one containing the corporate ownership structure of Piedmont Community Bank. I laid the documents out, a complex flowchart of holding companies and subsidiaries, and pointed to a name at the very top. "Thorn Capital Investments," I said. "That's me." David stared at the chart, his eyes tracing the lines of ownership down to the small community bank. His expression shifted from professional curiosity to stunned disbelief. He looked up at me, then back at the papers, then back at me again. "You're telling me you own the bank?" "My firm is the majority shareholder of the parent company," I corrected. "But for all practical purposes, yes. I own the bank that holds the multimillion-dollar loan for this entire subdivision." A slow grin spread across David's face. It was the look of a predator who has just been handed the keys to the henhouse. "Oh, this is beautiful," he breathed. "This is poetic. She's trying to condemn the house of the man who holds her mortgage. The question," I said, leaning back in my chair, "is how we play this card. We can't just call in the loan. That would hurt everyone, all the innocent homeowners who are just caught in the middle. It has to be targeted. It has to be a kill shot aimed directly at her." We spent the next 2 hours strategizing, planning the sequence of events with military precision. We would use the threat of the loan not as a cudgel, but as a lever. The HOA's loan agreement, like most commercial loans, contained covenants requiring responsible financial management and avoidance of any actions that could lead to significant legal liability. Karen, with her slush fund and her frivolous war against me, was in blatant violation of those covenants. We had the legal right to place the loan under immediate review and, if necessary, refuse to renew it when it came up for its 5-year review in just 3 months. A non-renewal would force the HOA to find new financing at a much higher interest rate, which would mean a massive increase in monthly dues for every single homeowner. The threat alone, if revealed at the right moment, would be enough to turn the entire community against her. "She's calling a special community meeting next month," I told David. "She wants to present her vision for the wellness center to be built on my land. She's even had architectural renderings made up. It's supposed to be her victory lap." David's grin widened. "That's our stage," he said. "That's where we spring the trap." Karen's special meeting was an exercise in pure hubris. She had booked the largest room in the Whispering Pines clubhouse, set up a projector, and arranged for catering. It was less a community meeting and more a coronation. She stood at the podium, basking in the fluorescent lights, a queen addressing her subjects. The room was packed. My allies and I had made sure of that. The Petersons were there, sitting in the front row. The Rodriguez family was in the back with their kids. At least a dozen other families I had spoken to were scattered throughout the crowd. We were a silent, observant block, waiting. Karen launched into her presentation. It was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak and veiled insults. She spoke of moving forward, enhancing community value, and resolving long-standing aesthetic inconsistencies. She never mentioned my name, only referring to the adjacent blighted property. Then, the renderings appeared on the screen. A sleek, modern building of glass and steel, with a sparkling pool and manicured gardens, superimposed over an aerial photo of my farmhouse. My home had been erased, replaced by her monument to beige. A murmur went through the crowd. Some were impressed by the shiny new thing she was promising. But I could see the looks of doubt on the faces of those who knew the truth. Karen opened the floor to questions, expecting softballs about the color of the pool tiles or the brand of the yoga mats. Arthur Peterson stood up, his voice frail but steady. Karen, this all looks very expensive. Could you tell us what the projected budget is for this wellness center? Karen waved a dismissive hand. The preliminary budget is well within our community's financial reach, Arthur. We have substantial reserve funds. This was my cue. I stood up. The room went quiet. All eyes turned to me, the villain of her story. Karen, I said, my voice calm and carrying easily across the room. Could you be more specific? You mentioned reserve funds, but the HOA's most recent financial disclosure shows operating reserves of less than $50,000. The kind of project you're proposing would cost millions. You also mentioned legal fees associated with the land acquisition. Your legal consulting budget has already tripled in the last year. Could you tell the residents exactly how much of their money you've spent so far trying to take my home? Her face flushed a blotchy red. That is confidential board information, Mr. Thorne, and you are not a member of this community. You have no right to ask. Every homeowner here has a right to know how their money is being spent. I countered, turning to the audience. Especially when it's being spent on a personal vendetta that has no chance of success. My property is not for sale. It will not be condemned. Any money the board spends on this fantasy is being thrown away. Another resident, a young woman I'd spoken to named Sarah, stood up. I'd like to know about the legal fees too. My husband and I were fined $500 because our trash cans were visible from the street for 2 hours. Where is that money going? Is it paying for this? The room erupted. Questions started flying from all corners, not about the wellness center, but about the fines, the budget, the lack of transparency. My allies, armed with the knowledge of Karen's financial mismanagement, began asking pointed, specific questions she couldn't answer. The meeting was devolving into a referendum on her leadership. Karen banged her gavel, her face a mask of fury. This meeting is about the future of our community, not about petty bookkeeping. We are talking about progress. But it was too late. The seeds of doubt had been sown. People were looking at the shiny renderings on the screen not as a promise, but as a symbol of the money being siphoned from their pockets for one woman's obsession. I had achieved my objective for the night. I hadn't revealed my trump card, but I had turned her own carefully staged event against her. She had wanted to unite the community against me. Instead, I had shown them that I was not the enemy. The enemy was standing at the podium, gavel in hand, losing control. The trap was set. Now it was time to arm the trigger. The day after the disastrous community meeting, David filed the lawsuit. It was a sweeping civil complaint, filed on behalf of myself, the Petersons, the Rodriguez family, and 10 other named plaintiffs, representing a coalition of aggrieved homeowners. The defendant was the Whispering Pines Estates HOA, with a special emphasis on the actions of its president, Karen Miller. The suit alleged a host of offenses: targeted harassment, breach of fiduciary duty, financial malfeasance, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. We weren't just asking for an injunction to stop her actions against my farm. We were demanding a full, court-ordered audit of the HOA's finances for the entire duration of Karen's presidency. We were also seeking punitive damages for the emotional distress and financial harm she had inflicted on the families she had bullied. The lawsuit landed like a bomb. A process server delivered the papers to Karen personally during her morning power walk. According to witnesses, she read the first page, turned pale, and nearly stumbled into her prize-winning rose bushes. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Suddenly, the whispers of discontent became open conversation. People were talking in their driveways, at the community mailboxes, at the pool. The lawsuit gave them cover. It legitimized their complaints and showed them they weren't alone. It also had an immediate practical effect. It put the HOA's insurance carrier on notice. Their lawyers would now be scrutinizing every decision Karen made. Her slush fund was effectively frozen, and her power to write checks to her brother-in-law's law firm was curtailed. She was legally cornered. Her response was predictable. She doubled down. She sent out a frantic, all-caps e-newsletter branding the lawsuit a malicious attack on our community and our way of life by a disgruntled outsider and his handful of troublemaking accomplices. She portrayed herself as the victim, the noble defender of property values under siege. She called for an emergency meeting to rally her supporters and vote on a special assessment to fund the legal battle against us. It was a fatal miscalculation. Asking people who were already questioning your financial management to give you more money to defend yourself against a lawsuit alleging financial mismanagement is a special kind of tone-deaf arrogance. This special assessment was the final piece of evidence we needed to show she was willing to burn the whole village down to save her throne. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. The annual HOA board meeting, which also served as the election for board members, was just 3 weeks away. It would be the final battlefield. Our coalition worked tirelessly. We went door to door, not to campaign, but to inform. We handed out simple, one-page summaries of the lawsuit and the documented financial irregularities. We didn't tell people how to vote. We just gave them the facts and let them decide for themselves. The response was overwhelming. People were angry. They felt betrayed. They had trusted Karen to manage their community, and she had used their money and their trust to fuel her own ego and enrich her family. Meanwhile, I made a quiet call to the CEO of Piedmont Community Bank's parent company. I didn't have to give him orders, merely a professional courtesy call. I laid out the situation. The HOA, a major debtor, was embroiled in a serious lawsuit alleging gross financial mismanagement by its leadership. The legal and financial risks were substantial. As the primary lender, the bank had a fiduciary duty to its shareholders to mitigate that risk. He understood immediately. The wheels began to turn within the bank's legal and risk assessment departments. A formal letter was drafted, the language cold, professional, and utterly devastating. It would be the final nail in Karen's coffin. We decided to hold it until the perfect moment. The night of the annual meeting arrived. The clubhouse was filled to capacity, the air thick with tension. Karen and her 2 cronies, Barb and Sheila, sat at a table at the front, looking grim. They had the proxies of the absentee homeowners and were confident they still had the numbers to win. Our side was organized. Arthur Peterson had agreed to run for president, with a slate of other reasonable, community-minded residents running for the other board positions. Karen began the meeting, her voice tight with rage. She dispensed with the usual pleasantries and launched directly into a tirade against me, against the lawsuit, against the ingrates who dared to question her leadership. It was a rambling, self-pitying monologue that did her no favors. She looked unhinged. As she paused to take a breath, preparing for her final, rallying cry, the main doors of the clubhouse opened. A woman in a sharp business suit walked in, carrying a briefcase. She was a senior vice president from Piedmont Community Bank, a woman named Ms. Albright. I had spoken to her that afternoon. She was professional, discreet, and had a backbone of pure steel. She walked directly to the front table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "I am here on behalf of Piedmont Community Bank. I have an official notice for the board of directors." She placed a thick envelope on the table in front of Karen. Karen stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. The bank's logo, Piedmont Community Bank, was printed elegantly in the top left corner. A collective gasp went through the room. Everyone in Whispering Pines knew who Piedmont was. They were the invisible entity to whom everyone paid their dues. Ms. Albright stood with perfect posture, her expression unreadable, waiting. With trembling hands, Karen picked up the envelope and tore it open. Her eyes scanned the first few lines of the letter. The color drained from her face, leaving a pasty, slack-jawed mask of shock. She looked up, her gaze sweeping across the room until it landed on me. In her eyes, for the first time, I saw not just anger, but fear. Genuine, soul-deep fear. She finally understood. She had been outmaneuvered, outplanned, and utterly defeated. The room was dead silent. Arthur Peterson stood up. "Karen," he said, his voice respectful but firm. "As this notice appears to concern the entire community's financial standing, I believe it should be read aloud to the homeowners." Karen just sat there, catatonic. Sheila, her ever-loyal crony, snatched the letter. Her eyes widened as she read. She looked at Karen, then at the crowd, and her bravado crumbled. Ms. Albright cleared her throat. "If the board is unable to present the notice, I can summarize its contents," she said in a clear, professional tone. Piedmont Community Bank is the holder of the master loan for the Whispering Pines Estates development. This loan is subject to covenants that require responsible fiscal management and the avoidance of undue legal and financial risks by the HOA board. The lawsuit filed against the board, specifically citing allegations of financial malfeasance and reckless behavior by its president, represents a significant and unacceptable level of risk to the bank's investment. Therefore, we are placing the loan under immediate and formal review. The board has 30 days to provide a satisfactory plan to mitigate this risk. Failure to do so may result in the bank calling the loan due in full or refusing to renew it under any circumstances. The silence in the room was replaced by a roar of panicked conversation. The legalese was dense, but the meaning was brutally clear. Karen's personal war had put every single one of their homes on the line. If the bank called the loan, the HOA would be bankrupt. They would be forced to find a new lender in the middle of a major lawsuit, an impossible task. The only alternative would be a catastrophic special assessment, potentially tens of thousands of dollars per household, to pay off the bank. Their property values, the very thing Karen claimed to be protecting, would be annihilated. She hadn't just been a bully. She had been a clear and present danger to their financial solvency. A man in the back of the room, someone I didn't even know, jumped to his feet. "You did this," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Karen. "You were so obsessed with that farm that you were willing to bankrupt all of us." The dam broke. The anger and fear that had been simmering for years boiled over. The room erupted in a chorus of accusations and demands for her resignation. Karen just sat there, speechless, the letter shaking in her hand. Barb and Sheila were already trying to distance themselves from her, their faces pale with panic. The election that followed was a formality. The vote was nearly unanimous. Karen Miller was removed from the board. Arthur Peterson was elected the new president, and his entire slate of reform candidates swept into office. Karen didn't even wait for the final count. She gathered her things and fled the clubhouse, not with the defiant strut of a deposed queen, but with the hunched shuffle of a broken woman. She was ruined. Her power, which had been built on a foundation of fear and paper-thin rules, had evaporated in an instant when faced with a real consequence. As the meeting adjourned and the relieved homeowners began to celebrate, Arthur came over and shook my hand. "Thank you, Marcus," he said, his eyes shining with gratitude. "You saved our community. You saved it yourselves," I replied. "You just needed a reason to stand together." I looked around the room, at the faces of my neighbors, people who had once viewed me with suspicion, now looking at me with respect and relief. The war was over. Now the work of rebuilding could begin. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The new board, led by Arthur Peterson, immediately commissioned a forensic audit of the HOA's finances. The results were as damning as I had expected. The audit uncovered years of embezzlement, self-dealing, and outright theft, all orchestrated by Karen. The evidence was turned over to the district attorney's office. Karen Miller, along with her sister and brother-in-law, was indicted on multiple felony charges, including fraud and embezzlement. Her reign of suburban terror ended not with a bang, but with the quiet click of handcuffs. The lawsuit our coalition had filed was settled quickly. The HOA's insurance paid a modest settlement to the families Karen had targeted, and the board issued a formal, public apology to me and to the community. Most importantly, they passed a new bylaw, which we all called the Thorn Amendment, permanently acknowledging the legal and historical separation of my farm from the Whispering Pines subdivision, ensuring no future board could ever attempt such a land grab again. As a gesture of good faith, I had Ms. Albright and her team from the bank meet with the new board. We restructured the community's loan, securing a lower interest rate that saved the homeowners a significant amount of money and put the HOA on a path to long-term financial stability. The fear that had gripped the neighborhood was replaced by a sense of shared purpose and relief. A few weeks later, on a warm Saturday afternoon, I hosted a barbecue. I sent out an open invitation to all the residents of Whispering Pines. I wasn't sure how many would come. To my surprise, my fields were filled with cars. Families spread out on blankets in the pasture. Kids chased my chickens, and neighbors who had only ever exchanged curt nods were now sharing stories and laughing. Arthur Peterson and I stood on my porch watching the scene. He raised his beer bottle in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said. I clinked my bottle against his. To good neighbors near the old stone wall, a group of men from the neighborhood were gathered. They had shovels and crowbars. I watched as they began to carefully dismantle a small section of the wall, not to tear it down, but to create an opening, a proper gate between my property and theirs. It was a symbolic act, a removal of the barrier that Karen had tried so hard to fortify. It was their idea, a way of saying that we were no longer two separate, feuding territories but one community. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fields, I sat on my porch swing, the same one my grandfather had built. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter and the smell of wood smoke from the barbecue pit. A young couple, the Rodriguez family, walked up with their two small children. Their little boy, no older than 5, ran up my steps and handed me a crayon drawing. It was a picture of a big old farmhouse with a smiling sun above it, next to a bunch of smaller beige houses. In the drawing, all the people from all the houses were holding hands. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," Mr. Rodriguez said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave us our neighborhood back." I looked at the drawing, then out at the community I had inadvertently helped to heal. I came back to this farm seeking peace and quiet, a refuge from a world of conflict. Instead, I found a different kind of battle, one fought not with guns and strategy, but with paperwork, persistence, and the quiet courage of ordinary people standing up to a bully. My home was safe. The legacy of my family was secure. But the victory felt bigger than that. It was a victory for the simple idea that a community is not defined by its rules and regulations, but by the decency and respect its members show to one another. The last of the guests had gone, and the fireflies were beginning to rise from the tall grass. The moon was climbing over the tops of the pecan trees. I leaned my head back, the old wood of the farmhouse solid behind me. I was home, and for the first time in a very long time, I was truly at peace. The blight was gone. Not my farm, which stood as proud and enduring as ever, but the real blight, the one that had taken root in the heart of a woman who valued power over people and conformity over character. Whispering Pines was finally living up to its name. It was quiet, it was peaceful, and it was free.